Welcome everyone, let's get started. Let me just remind you of a couple things where this is week 5, in case you didn't know. All right, so we're in week 5, that's halfway through the quarter. That's always a good time to remind you of a couple things. One is the exegetical assignment's been posted. It's been on D2L for a while. It's not due until the 25th, but I promised to have it posted by today, so it's been posted for a while actually. So if you haven't thought about it since I mentioned it earlier, that's okay. But now it's time to start thinking about it. You need to look at just pick one of those passages I gave to you. So let me pull them back up here real quick. So one of these passages, you've got 6 to choose from here. They're all difficult, right? That's the nature of the beast, as far as I can tell. I couldn't have picked one passage out of the science of logic and it would have been, oh yeah, that's pretty elementary, pretty rudiment. They're all difficult like this. So I tried to pick ones that I thought were really central and important, and they are led up to by certain arguments, and certain arguments follow from them. So they're pivotal in these kinds of ways. You're going to be tempted, so I'll go ahead and answer this question that you're going to ask me, and that is, well, Kevin, I picked one of them, right, fine. Do I have to go back and reconstruct everything from being up to it? So like if you pick the truth of being is essence, do I have to go back and talk about being nothing, becoming everything? No, right? Because then you would be rewriting the entirety of the science of logic. I'm not asking you to do that. But you will need to back up some, right, to talk about what this means. And where that is, you'll have to determine, try to figure out. It takes some work, but you can absolutely do it. And once you figure that out, then you'll know how far back you need to go to make this make sense, and then you'll be able to explain this. Remember, the assignment is exegesis, right? You're doing 2 things. You're telling me what that passage says and why it says it. So the what it says is just explicating what literally is there in that particular passage. Difficult enough, right, to say it in non-Hegelian technical jargon without quoting Hegel to make sense of it. No secondary sources, so can't quote those either. In your own language as best as possible, try to actually do that. And then, why do they say it? Well, the why they say it is usually because this is the result of an argument they're making or an analysis they're making, and you want to go back and reconstruct that analysis to show how this follows necessarily and imminently from it. Right? So that's what you're trying to do. That's enough. But that's all the assignment is. You're not trying to take a thesis on that or approach that and say, I think they're right about this, I think they're wrong. None of that kind of stuff. You're just literally trying to, as best you can, make sense of whatever passage you select from Hegel and do the work of trying to explicate an argument either it's already in that passage or that passage is the culmination of or whatever else it might be. Does that make some sense? So I'm saying this to remind you that we're in week 5. It's time to start working on this. It's not due until November 25th at D2L midnight, which is 11:59 p.m. I've got a submission folder ready for you. If you want to submit it today, it's ready for you today. But if you're not, I appreciate you might not be ready to do that. That's fine. But here's what I don't suggest you do. Right? Don't wait until November 24th to get to work on this. That would be a tragic, horrible, horrible mistake. Right? It's not long, right? It doesn't require that it be long. It's 1,500 to 2,100 words, 5 to 7 pages, but you don't need to put it off, is my point to you, right? You'll be tempted to do that because you have other things that are pressing, you're trying to write other papers, that's fine. I did give you the latest date I could give you to try to help with that, right? To try to give you some time after the quarter is over, right? So we'll be finished we'll be finished on the 12th of November, so you have time then. But make sure you pick one of the passages already, right? That you're doing that, you're thinking about that. That's what I'm trying to remind you of right now. And then as you were going through it, I'm going to hopefully have talked about all of these passages by the end of the quarter. But I wouldn't wait on that. Right? I wouldn't wait on that. I'd go through and try to actually pick one now and say, I'm going to focus on this and try to work your way around that passage, make some sense of that passage. Why is it what it is? Why does it say what it does? Those sorts of matters. Questions, problems, or issues about that assignment? It's the only assignment for the quarter. It's all you need for this class. No presentations, no nothing else. Trust me, this is an incredibly difficult stuff to do, but it's incredibly valuable, not only in Hegel, but beyond Hegel. All philosophers are hard to explicate. Let's work on your explication skills. That's what this is for. Questions, problems, or issues about that? Yeah, Nicolai.
Do you want footnotes just so you can see where in the text specifically we're looking justify what we're saying, but just to show you where we're looking.
You can cite if you want to like that, to say I'm drawing this from this passage or something like that, but I don't have to have that. It should be fairly apparent to me where you're drawing from, but if you want to give me that stuff, that's fine, I don't require it. What I do want you to do is to give me the passage. Sometimes people forget this in their rush to explicate a passage, they forget actually telling me which passage they're explicating. So give me at the top of your paper, put your name somewhere up there so I know who it is, and then put this, that, or whichever one you pick up at the top. Just literally cut and paste it there, and then get to go. You don't need an intro, you don't need a conclusion, because you're not writing a research paper here. Purely exegesis. What does that passage say? Why does it say? Other questions, problems, or issues? Yeah, please.
So we don't have to make a basic thesis based on the concept? Because I remember like 2 years ago, I don't know, I made like a basic statement or basic thesis, and then I...
You don't have to do that, right? You just have to answer those two questions. What's being said there, and why is it being said? Nothing more than that. So you don't have to make an assessment of whether Hegel's right about something or not. You have to make an assessment about who's right about the interpretation of the passage, your own take, none of that. Right? Just as best you can, tell me what you think, as best you can, what Hegel's saying there, in the least Hegelian technical jargon as you possibly can, because explicating Hegel and Hegel's terminology doesn't really help. We've got a whole book of that. We need to be able to say it in non-Hegelian terminology. By the way, I am trying to exemplify this for you every week, right? I come in here, that's what I'm doing about a variety of different passages, these included, obviously. But I can testify to how difficult it is. It's hard every week when I come in here and try to say, well, isn't this, it's not clear at all, right? So, questions, problems, or issues about this time? All right, so the other thing I wanted to remind you of is that I put up on D2L a glossary, just a 2-page little short glossary of Hegelian terminology and vocabulary that's useful to have, particularly for the science of logic. I just gathered this over the years, and by no means is it exhaustive. There's a ton of other terms, concepts I could have put on here and probably need to be on here, but this is enough to get you going. There's 2 pages of this. So you can use that as a reference point when you start to work your way through the science of logic. You can come on a term and you don't really know what it means, or you think it's important, but you're not clear about how Hegel's using it. It's probably worth taking a look at the glossary. I've built on the shoulders of others, right? So there's dictionaries out there you can look at that will give you this kind of stuff as well. But I thought it'd be useful to have as a quick handy reference, kind of abbreviated form here for you to look at. So that's on D2L as well. I realized once I got to looking at this today that I forgot to put the outline for today's material that I assigned for today. It's not really that technical difficult, but I'll put it up tonight when I get back home. And then, what else we got here? Oh yeah, I did put on here this thing, which we'll talk about after a while. This is the transition from quality to quantity. Well, that's an outline, purported outline of the transition, if it works or not. This is one of the most hard, difficult, mysterious transitions. You'll think all of them are hard, difficult, and mysterious. That may not pick this one out uniquely, but it is a hard, difficult one because it seems so counterintuitive, right? To go from quality to quantity, right? It's much more natural to say, well, something has quantitative determination, and then on top of that, right, it has qualitative determinations of various kinds. So how much of something, the quantitative determination, seems like it should be prior, right? Just even in the order of explication, the order of unpacking the nature of reality. We would start with how much something is, quantitative determination, its magnitude, and then we would get to its qualitative determination, reality or not, right? Doesn't really matter. Something has to be how much. And Hegel's quite clear about this, right? He knows that he's going against our standard understanding of this. So take a look with me. This is back in the introduction. No, sorry, this is in the Journal Division of Being. So page 56, bottom of page 56 in the translation. This is 67 in the German. He says, he's going through the divisions. He says, this will sound somewhat like the Kantian categories, right? We're going to talk about quantity, quality, relation, modality. And then he says, take a look at the next paragraph down. This can only perhaps be remarked, that the determination of quantity is ordinarily listed ahead of quality. So he knows, he gets it, right? Makes perfect sense. And as a rule, this is done for no given reason. That's his problem with it, right? completely intuitive, but intuition doesn't guide, right? Sensible intuition in this case doesn't dictate. Conceptual determinations dictate. So he says, it has already been shown that the beginning is made with being as such. Well, that's where that's what he's already introduced here in the introduction. That's with what must the beginning be made. Whether we go through the route of mediation through the phenomenology, or we go through immediate route, or both of them have to be used together, and just think purely, or both of them have to be used together. We have to use that together with the phenomenology. We end up with what? Pure thinking, which is pure being. Right? So that's what he's referring to there. Then he says, and hence with qualitative being. So being as such is already qualitative being. Well, not in our standard understanding of quality, it's not. Right? Our standard understanding of quality is that that's a property that something possesses. And for something to possess a property, there has to be, something. And that something, most simply, is like good old Aristotelian substance metaphysics. There has to be something. For there to be something, it's probably going to be, magnitude of some kind. So that ought to come first. He says, it is clear from a comparison of quality with quantity that the former, that's quality, is by nature first. You will say, I'm not so clear about that yet. Right? That's fine. For quantity is quality which has already become negative. Well, there's a definition that helps no one, right, at that point, right? You don't read that and go, well, yeah, I guess if I just gotten that cleared up. No, right? That's something he's got to actually prove. That's what the transition from quality to quantity has got to demonstrate. That quantity is what? That it is quality, so quantity is quality. So quality is prior in the order of being. Quality which has already become negative. How is that going to work? That doesn't sound like quantity. Magnitude is the determinateness which no longer one with being, but already distinguished from it, is the sublated quality that has become indifferent. Hold on to the term negative and term indifferent. We're going to come back to those as they're absolutely crucial to the transition from quality to quantity. He says it includes the alterability of being without altering. A phrase we'll come back to at the very end of the quality section. This is all taken from the end of the quality section in the transition. Altering the fact itself, the matter itself, namely being of which it is the determination. Qualitative determinants is on the contrary one with its being. It neither transcends it nor stays within it, but is its immediate restrictedness. We'll come back to this notion of restrictedness as well. Hence, quality, as the determinants which is immediate, is the first, and it is with it that the beginning is to be made. So there's this case in a nutshell, right? Too much of a nutshell, right? But in a nutshell, for why quality comes first. Why? Because quality can't be thought of as some determination of something. Get that, right? Quality is not the determination of something. It's not a quality possessed by some underlying substance. Quality just is the presencing of something, the presence of something, to use the term he uses for it, reality of something, being as such, and nothing more and nothing less than that. That's all he means by quality here. So he's not talking about our standard conception of quality or the more intuitive sense of quality that we normally have. He's talking about the sense of quality that's more fundamental than all that. And that is that something has to be in order for it to be anything of some kind or another at all. So being as such, and then what that entails, which is what all that nutshell package is supposed to give us. We'll try to unpack that again today. And that's what will lead us then to see that quality ultimately, imminently, and necessarily entails quantity. Now, I want to say two things about that, then we'll dig in. Okay? And I'll take questions, then we'll dig in. First thing to say about that, what I just said, that quality necessarily and imminently entails quantity, is remember something, right? Remember something about how linear progressions operate in Hegel. So the first thing to say about that is that quality entails quantity means what? That quantity is actually the retrogressive ground of quality. You start with quality, but you don't start with foundations in Hegel. There are no foundations in Hegel. They don't work that way. So foundations aren't first. They're not the axiomatic beginning point. So being is not the locus, right? The center point, the ground of the entire logic. It is the most abstract, vacuous, empty, in that sense, irrelevant. That's a bit much, but it's vacuous. Right? It is literally nothing. And the rest of the book is an unpacking of what the determinations of being are. But those determinations are not determinations of some being that stands out there and then they're all applied to it. They're the unpacking of its determinations that are necessitated by its own intrinsic othering of itself. Negation is not just destructive, it's also positive. Right? And if that's the case, then quality entails quantity means just simply, but there's a lot in this, I acknowledge, but it just means then that being is inherently, to be what it is as quality, is necessarily quantity. So quantity is not something other than being, it's not something separate from being, it's a deeper determination of what it is to be. And we'll find out, as you've already seen through the reading for today, that ultimately quantity and quality are in relation with one another, that'll be measured. He tells you that in the next paragraph here in the general division. But we'll get to that next week, right? That's enough for us to make this transition, get into quantity this week. We'll get to measure next week. And there's a ton of stuff important about what goes on in measure, because it leads us in eventually into essence, but also just in terms of its own self. But also the important thing about this, so that's the first thing, so just to be, qualitative reality, to be, is to be, in this sense, ultimately magnitude, to have a magnitude. Now the second thing is related to this, but second, I just want to pull it out so we're really clear. That means, and this is going to be really, really difficult to hold to when he's talking about one and many. Right? It's going to be really difficult when he's talked about something and other, but it's going to be difficult really when we get to one and many. And that is, if that's true, if what I just said is true, that quality necessarily entails quantity, because it is what being is more fundamentally, then that means that everything we're talking about in quality is about being as such, with its determinateness, but never an entity, never a being, never. So you will look far and wide in the being discussion in quality to find an entity to be discussed. He never once is talking about an entity. He's always talking about the qualitativeness that is being as such, always. So even when he's talking about something and other, something is not, like this bottle and then something other than this bottle. That's not what he's, I know that's the way we want to hear it because that makes sense to us and we can try to begin to analogize and make some sense out of the logic as, oh, well, he's talking about like something exists and something other exists in that, that's the something and other dialectic that's going on, so that's what it's all. Actually, no. He doesn't have entities yet. They haven't been demonstrated. That would be to foist into that analysis something that's extrinsic to the analysis itself. Makes it incredibly difficult to stay with him, right? Stay with the analysis. In a sense, I always say this, Hegel is slower than you want him to be. Right? You want to jump ahead, we all do, right? We want to go to the world that we know with all its determinacies to try to make sense of the world he's talking about. And he's wanting to talk about that world and all of its determinacies. He just wants to do it in the slow patience that speculative reason demands for you to be able to unpack the actual determinations of each dimension of reality. And so you're going to be really frustrated that there are all sorts of determinations of the qualitative dimension of reality, qualitative dimension of being, and yet not a bit of it determines anything as an entity. But we get there. Fairly quickly in quantity, we get, well, quantity has to be a quantity. It has to be a discrete, as he calls it, and also continuous. There's a contradiction built into them between their discreteness and their continuity. Discreteness is where we first get any kind of entities themselves that we can talk about at all. So, and they're going to be very austere. Right? There's not going to be any determinations. They're not going to be red entities. They're not going to be green entities. They're not going to be sour. They're not going to be sweet. None of that stuff is going to be applicable anywhere in the logic framework. So this is the, to think abstractly does mean, to think purely does mean to think without all those determinations, but also to be patient and see how those things unfold if they do, without imposing them. Now that makes it always difficult because then you want to say, I'm afraid I'm imposing something when I'm asking this question. That's not a bad reservation to have, frankly, but that shouldn't keep you from asking the question, right? So I want you to hear both sides of that. Be wary of your presumptions that you bring into your question. You can charge Hegel with that sometimes. We'll look at passages and say, I think he's actually guilty of this. Right? He's got some positions in here that he's not warranted yet, those kinds of questions. But we also want to, and he thinks that about himself. We're going to talk about one pretty quickly today because he reverses himself in the encyclopedia and redoes the whole, 5 years later, redoes the whole analysis in a different way. But, so he's up for changing his own views about matters. He does quite often, frankly. But we want to be cautious about that, but that caution shouldn't be destabilizing or paralyzing. You can ask the question, even if I'm going to say to you, if Hegel's going to say to you, doesn't that presuppose some things? You're going to say, yeah, I think it does, but isn't there a nugget of something here that's troubling? And we'll try to figure out what that is. That's a critical way, as far as I can tell, to read the science of logic. Make some sense? All right. Questions, issues, problems about what we did last week? All of it's a complete blur. Some of it was at least made somewhat sense. Yeah.
I have a silly question, kind
Sure.
of, and it applies to what you've said in the first lecture.
Yeah.
So in this relationship of retrogressive grounded, the latter is the ground of the former.
Yeah.
And then, so complete the sentence. The former is the x of the latter. What is it? What's the relation from the other perspective?
From the other perspective?
Yeah, other direction.
So what comes last is the truth of the former. Right? So it's the truth of, but it's also the result of, and therefore it is the ground of.
Right. My question is the former is the what of the latter.
Yeah, it's you can put this in a variety of different ways. It is what, let me use this terminology and then be cautious about it, because in the Doctrine of Essence, we're going to have to complicate this. But for the moment, I think it works well enough. You could say that the latter is the ground of the former. So it's grounded in, right? You could say being is grounded in, you could say quality is grounded in quantity, and quality are both going to be grounded in measure. So to put it in a content language, because this is, the way of thinking about it is regressive, right? You can think about what are the conditions being laid out here. Well, the conditions being laid out are the conditions of the possibility of what it is to be at all, qualitatively. Measure is the condition of the possibility for both of those to be.
I don't think you're answering my question.
Good.
I'm saying, I understand this. This is all clear.
Yeah.
The latter is the ground of the former. Clear,
Yeah.
no problem. My question is about, so if I want to describe from the former's perspective, not from the latter's perspective, what do I say? Right.
That's what I'm grounded in. That's all it really can be said about it. That's what it entails. That's what it ultimately issues forth in.
That's what I'm wondering is like, okay, entail, because if we say entail, okay.
Yeah, it's an entailment relation.
Then
All these are
what's-
entailment and inferential relations. So this is, so yes, thanks.
So then what's the difference between entailment and grounding?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay.
Not in the science of logic, not in Hegel, as far as I
Okay.
can tell. Right? The way you demonstrate that something is grounded in something else is through logical entailment and logical entailment only. Right? Inferential relations, that's what the entire system is about. That's why we're after, as he said, the necessity of the concept. Necessity comes from it's logical necessity. It's other kinds of necessity as well. But it's logical necessity minimally, right, in these inferential relations. Is that useful? Yeah, so one way to say it is being is going to be grounded in essence, essence and being are both going to be grounded in the concept. That's the master overarching relationship of the logic. What does that mean from the perspective of being? It means that being is, because it's grounded in that, but that means it is, we could say, the grounded for what is grounded in. And Hegel will call that, I don't have it up there now, he will call that the appearance then. It appears, the ground appears, right? Essence must appear, right?
I like
Essence
appearance.
must appear as being.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, concerns? Lots of concerns. Any ones you want to articulate this one? All right. So let's take a look at the terrain we covered last week. And the best way I know to do that is just sort of walk us through, not literally step by step, but highlight through highlight, right? So let me do this without going through the text in some detail and just talk us through the major claims that Hegel's laid out and talk a little bit about how he makes it from one to the next. And then that'll lead us to the question about finitude, which is what we left off with last time. Then I'll focus down on that. We'll look at the two different kinds of infinity that emerge out of that, and then onto there from being for self and to this transition. All right, so let's start here. Being is becoming. Being is becoming. Being, pure being, is sheer indeterminacy, sheer immediacy, says Hegel. But as such, being is incapable of picking anything out, marking anything as determinate. And therefore, pure being is sheer, utter, absolute emptiness, vacuousness, nothing. And that's just nothing at all, for nothing is just sheer emptiness, indeterminacy. Hence, as we saw last time, being and nothing are the same. They're the same. But to be and to not be, being and nothing, though both are equally vacuous and thus the same, nonetheless possess an ineliminable, irreducible, indefinable really, difference, a distinction between them, because what is not simply identical to what is not. So though they're the same, they're actually not the same. To be is not simply the same as not to be. So being and nothing are not the same. As at once the same and not the same, being and nothing have always already, Hegel says, passed over into one another. Being is always already nothing, and nothing is always already being. Hence, being and nothing, as he says famously, vanish into one another. And that vanishing of being and nothing immediately into one another is the movement of becoming. So being is becoming. It's that vanishing being into becoming, into nothing, nothing into being. A process, that vanishing, that becoming, is a process that begins in the moment of coming to be and ends in the moment of ceasing to be. Moment there is not temporal moments, logical moments. So not the coming to being and passing away of a thing, note. Here's that point about no discrete entities yet, right? So it's not the coming to being and passing away of a thing, but simply coming to being and ceasing to be as such. So, and I'll try to do this with each stage. Note the work of negativity here for just a moment. Let's track that as we go through here, the work of negativity. So you have kind of two moments of negativity here. The indefinable non-identity of being and nothing. So there's one moment of negativity. It's already operative, already at work here. And there's also the work of negativity in the sense of ceasing to be, right? Coming to being and passing away, ceasing to be. So far, so good, I think. So that takes us to becoming. And then Hegel wants to say, this is just straightforward identification predication here. Becoming is existence. Becoming is existence. Note, it's important to get that it is, not becoming issues forth in existence. Becoming becomes some existent thing. All ways you could be tempted to read that, but none of that's authorized by what he says. What he says is becoming just is existence. How so? If becoming is being and nothing, as coming to being and passing away or ceasing to be, then since those are opposed moments, they counterbalance one another. They together make up a stable and specific equilibrium. That's the way Hegel describes it. So the flow of becoming is therefore continuing, persistent, stable flow and determinate presence. It's a peaceful, simple oneness. Well, that flow is becoming, but the stability of that flow, the continuingness of that flow, that's existence. So existence is the term we use to mark the stability of the flow of becoming itself. Now, insofar as existence contains within it non-being, right? You could define existence as being that is non-being, being that is non-being, right? Coming to being, passing away, being that is non-being. Insofar as existence contains within it non-being, contains within itself non-being, it exists, it is present, it is being that is non-being. And the presence of existence is then always a passing away that is immediately one with coming to be. Hence, existence is presence that bears within itself differentiation. It bears that work of negativity within itself as well, in the form of the unity of being and non-being. And it follows from this that being is now determinate, marked out precisely as the presence that is both being and non-being. In German, the term we're translating here, that's being translated here as existence, is Dasein, right? And he says the only difference between Sein and Dasein is Da, right? And the Da, right, doesn't mean the there. It's not a spatial declaration. It has some determinacy where Sein didn't. Well, what's its determinacy? Has it got full-fledged spatio-temporal determination? By no means. Space and time, nowhere to be found in the logic. So what kind of determinacy do we have here? Just that it has the determinacy of being real because it's marked out as real over against the negation of its reality. So being is existence as qualitativeness, and here we have negation explicitly on the table. It's already been at work, right? But now we see it named as such. We see the moments of existence are both reality and negation. It is, and non-being is it's in, as he says at one moment, burdened with, infected with non-being. So far, so good. Now, I want to pause at that moment, right? Because a lot just happened, right? And I always think it's worth knowing a lot just happened in Hegel, because sometimes you think, well, you know, he's just really kind of going along saying the same thing, isn't he? I mean, it's just kind of repetitive. And Hegel thinks this is not a repetitive moment. This isn't just, I've said this already, let me say it again so it's clear. He's saying it again because he thinks reality and negation are different than coming to being and passing away. That they are both moments now, distinct moments, not just flowing into one another, not just vanishing into one another, but they have a kind of stability of their own. Reality and negation. And they have such stability, right? We've been talking about the simple oneness of the flow of becoming. We start then with the simple oneness, and the rule of simple oneness is marked by reality. So we start with really reality. It has a kind of prominence here, over against negation. Negation is almost, it's like being that, yeah, has some non-being. But really, it's being, reality, that, you know, is burdened with some negation. But as we quickly find out, and this is why a lot's going on here, Hegel's going to make the point repeatedly now that reality is real by virtue of negation. Negation is not just what's alongside it, there with it too. It's that which is actually doing all the work. It's constitutive. Now, we begin to see that with the notion of something, etwas, something. Again, something's not a bottle, a book, a book bag, whatever. It's not something like that. What does something mean? Something just means, Hegel's using that term to mean nothing other than the self-relatedness of being. That being, Dasein, existence, has a self-relatedness about it. Self-relatedness. It's unto itself. It's related unto itself. Something that was not true of being, it's not true of nothing really, wasn't true in becoming certainly at all. Coming to be passes over into passing away. Passing away reverts back into coming to be. I mean, they don't have any stability of their own. They don't have any self-identity. They don't have any self-relation. Well, reality has a self-relation. And that self-relation is what we mean by something. But something is what it is by virtue of what? Other. Other. There's negation. Now notice, here's where things really get going in the logic in a lot of ways as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they've already been going, but a lot follows from this. A lot starts to work about this. I think, as I mentioned before, if Hegel's right about this, he's maybe right about everything else. He's certainly right about a lot of things that follow from it. If he's right that what? That something is not just related to something other than it, which is not novel, right? Everyone in the history of philosophy will say, yeah, there are things that are related to other things that they are not, right? Okay. What's the big deal? And Hegel's saying, well, first of all, we're not talking about things. We're talking in a more fundamental dimension even than that. So we're talking about being and nothing. Okay, fine, right? Okay, so Parmenides, Heraclitus, we got it. What's the big deal? And he wants to say, no, we're past that. Right? What we're talking about here is that being as quality has a self-relatedness. That's its somethingness. That's what something marks. Is it's only its self-relatedness. Not that it is some determinate entity, but just that it is something. It has self-relatedness. Well, then that's marked off against something that's other than that. So it sounds like there's two entities now. There can't be, there's no entities. But it sounds like there's two entities. There's this entity called something, and this other entity called something other. And so there you go, that's the relationship. And Hegel's saying, no, slow that down for just a moment. The way this actually works is that otherness, the other, is actually a verb. It's an activity. It's othering. It constantly makes possible the self-relatedness of something, but also constantly undermines its self-relatedness. So you want to say, well, existence then, at this moment, is both self-related. It's got a kind of stability. That's all self-relatedness means. It's got a kind of stability, a kind of relative persistence. Let's not say permanent, that's too temporal. Persistence. It holds itself together. Right? It's coherent. But it's not just related to other, right? As though it had its coherence and then, yeah, it's also related to something other than itself. That otherness is actually generative. That's Hegel's claim. It's generative of the self-relation. In other words, the self-relation only has its own possibility. It's only able to be self-related in and through the othering, negation, that makes it possible, that does that work. So self-relation is not over against the other, it's actually made possible by the other. So self-relation is made possible by other, where otherness is really the work of negation itself. It's, you could say, othering. So every form of stability we think we might have here in the qualitative dimension of being is continually being undermined by this othering of it. Well, that allows him then to make this claim that existence is not only something, but something is alteration. Something is in constant change. Now, a lot of times when you reach that point, you want to go, oh, we've already done this. This being, nothing, becoming, right? So, shock, right? Something, other, alteration. Why don't we just stop being, nothing, becoming again? Why don't we just simply repeat it? Here's where there's been progression. Let's make that claim because Hegel thinks there has. I'll try to explicate what that is in just a second. But it's very minimal progression. So what is the progression? Well, in becoming, we had the passing away of coming to being, passing away into one another. They vanish into one another. And the only stability you get there is what? The vanishing of the vanishing, right? The stability of, they vanish into one another, so they vanish into one another, leaves them a kind of stability and a peace and semblance. That's existence, that's Dasein, right? So there's that. We're not there anymore. Why not? Because reality has a kind of stability. It stands on its own. It's not like coming to being and passing away, which don't stand on their own. So we're not back in becoming anymore. We're at something where a moment of being has a solidity. Let me use that term very cautiously here. There's no solidity really here to talk about. We'll get solidity if we want to talk about that magnitude and when we look at quantitative determination. But let's say that it has a kind of persistence or solidity here. That's what reality is. But it has it by virtue of, and it owes its solidity to, this othering process that's going on continually within it. The other moment, which has also a kind of solidity here, a kind of stability here, that it didn't have in becoming. So this isn't just the ceaseless flow of becoming anymore. This is change and alteration. Where what? Where the self-identity, the self-relation of reality is constantly happening, but also constantly being undermined as well. That's the difference between becoming, which is sheer flow, and the becoming of a moment, and the transformation of that moment into another moment, into another moment, into another moment of reality. So change, alteration is not becoming. He's going to, at the end of this, line them all up. He's going to say, here's what all three of them, there'll be three by the time we get there, here's what all three of them mean. He'll go back and rehearse this for you, precisely to make this point, that becoming is not alteration, and alteration, surprisingly, is not infinity. Because infinity is going to turn out to be another name for this process that we're now seeing recur at different levels, different dimensions. So far, so good? Questions? I mean, in a sense, all that Hegel has shown, right, is that no being without non-being. And look what non-being does. It advances being to be real, but it also undermines it to constantly be alterable. It does it first as passing away, and then, not first, but it does it as passing away and becoming, and then it does it here in the sense of othering. So something is alteration. Something is alteration. So something and other are not two separate aspects of presence or reality, or even two distinct or discrete entities. Rather, it is reality as a whole, being, existence as such, as existing and also having an otherness, alterity, that stands as its negation. Existence qua something is what it is being, it is reality, and it is what it is not. It is nothing, it is negation. It is being for itself, reality, in and through its being other than itself, negation, not being. Now, I want to press that last point home a little more because I think it's important for what we're going to do at the end of this chapter with being for itself. Because it sounds like we're already there. It sounds like, well, you know, if you've got reality, it has this self-relational structure, and that's made possible by the negational process, so aren't we already at being for itself, as he calls it at the end of the chapter? The answer is no. Why? Because being for itself actually integrates the negation within itself. We don't have that here. So think this through for just a moment. The self-relational structure is related to otherness. That's what makes it possible. but it never integrates that otherness into itself. That's what's going to make it constantly change, is that it never integrates that into itself. That's why it's going to constantly overcome itself. That's why the limit will have to be a restriction, and there's an ought structure. We talked about this at the end of class last time, that literally being ought to be other than it is because it's constantly burdened by non-being. It ought to be other than it is because negation constantly undermines its self-relatedness. It constitutes, it generates its self-relatedness, but it overcomes it. So reality is not being for itself. Being for itself is going to actually incorporate the negative moment. And that will render it indifferent, as we're about to look at, if this works. That will render it no longer quality. That will render it quantity. More about that in a little while. So far, so good. Reality is the or something is the self-relatedness of reality. Otherness is the othering of negation, doing its work, constantly undermining it. So something is necessarily alteration itself, change. Then Hegel wants to say, okay, what we've been able to show at that point is that change isn't incidental to being. Change is the actual constitution, the character, Beschaffenheit, right? What makes that thing what it is. Now we would say, oh, okay, that's an essence. Hegel says, we'll get there in time, my friends. Right? We haven't gotten to essences by any stretch of the imagination. We have gotten to something about what this thing is, but we haven't gotten to full-fledged essences yet, right? Essences are of a different order. We'll talk about those when we get there and when that's necessary. But at this moment, we have something in its Beschaffenheit, in its constitution, in its character, is really what makes that thing what it is. So the other then, in that respect, is its limit. Its limit, Grenze. It's what defines that thing, limits that thing, defines it as what it is. It gives it its self-relatedness. It's the circumferencing around of what that self-relatedness is. This far, no further. Right? That's what the othering does. It says this far, no further. This is what you are. This self-relatedness, this is what you are. But as we know, because the negation works in the way that it does, it constantly undermines and overcomes that self-relatedness. So that limit, the Grenze, always becomes a Schranke, a restriction that it has to be overcome. So the constitution doesn't just turn out to be alteration. The true, what it is to be the thing of being, is it's got an ought structure, Zolan, ought structure that's built into it. Not a moral ought. This is not the moral law. Kant famously tells us is the ought structure, and we can talk about hypothetical and categorical oughts. No, none of that. This is an ontological structure, and it's built out of negation itself. It's basically saying this: for every self-relation, it ought to be, by virtue of negation, it ought to be what it is. Right? It's a self-relation. So always, hold on to that moment, because it does have that moment. Unlike becoming, it doesn't all just collapse and fall apart. So it's got, reality has that something, right, of being self-related. But I'm going to put this in temporal terms. It doesn't work in simple terms. It works in logical terms. But the moment it becomes self-related, negation says, yeah, but no. You're not going to be able to remain that way. So I've prescribed a limit for you by saying othering, by othering you, right? You othering yourself. But you're going to have to surpass that. You're going to have to overcome that. You ought to be other than you are. So every self-relation ought to be changed by virtue of negation alone. So notice, the ought structure is not moral, it's ontological, it's built fully and completely out of the negation that's built within things. Again, this is Hegel just unfolding what it means for being to be infected, burdened with non-being. It's not just a baggage it takes around, it's actually what it owes its very being to. So here's the way he puts this. So I want to settle down here and take a look at this. This is on page 101. So if I lost everybody, we okay? Make a little bit of sense? I know some of those things are rough. You want to come back and ask about them, please do. But I think hopefully that made a little bit of sense, that review of where we've been. So take a look at 101. And here you're going to get a kind of summary passage. Hegel does these sometimes. You want to cling on to them and say, oh, okay. Here's where Hegel at least thinks he's taking this, right? Whether that's true or not is another matter, but let's at least get his account of the roadmap of where we've been. So here's what he says. This is the second full paragraph down. So existence is determinate, right under finitude, right? Existence is determinate, it's page 101, page 116 in the German. So he writes, existence is determinate. Something has a quality, right? So something is not an entity. Something is the self-relatedness of things, and it has a quality. Quality means it exists in some way. And in this quality, it is not only determined, but delimited. So there's that the othering structure prescribes its circumference, which it cannot exceed, the boundary which it cannot exceed, its limit. Its quality is its limit, and affected by it, something remains affirmative, quiescent existence. So there's Hegel to say, look, you didn't have this in becoming. This is something that has a kind of stability to itself. Something has a stability to itself. It has a self-relatedness to itself. And it owes that to having this limit that comes, as we know, from the work of other, the work of negation. So far, so good. Now the but. But so developed that the opposition of its existence and of negation as the limit immanent to this existence is the very in itselfness of the something. It's very constitution. That's what in itselfness here means. It's very constitution. And this is thus only becoming in it. This negation constitutes the finitude of the something. Well, finitude, right, means what? Limitation. So the limit isn't just what makes something what it is, it's its actual constriction, its limitation. He says now in the next paragraph down, when we say of things that they are finite, so this is where Hegel's sort of backing out for a moment and saying, okay, let me go back to the standard traditional conception of finitude. And I want to build on that, because there's a connection between that and what I'm trying to say. When we say of things that they are finite, we understand by this that they not only have a determinateness, that their quality is not only reality and existent determination, so we got all that stuff that I'm trying to establish, that they are not merely limited and as such still have existence outside the limit, but rather that non-being constitutes their nature. Non-being constitutes their nature. When we introduced existence, non-being was incidental. Existence is reality burdened with non-being, being burdened with non-being. Now it constitutes, non-being, constitutes its very nature, what it is to be that thing. He says, finite things are, but in there you have reference. This drives me nuts about Di Giovanni. This is Bazayan. This is relation, right? In reference is not really, he's doing this in linguistic terms. It's really in relation. So just about every time you see in reference, you can take that to be in relation. That becomes more critical in some places. I'll correct the translation when we get there. There's one of them. So finite things are, but in their relation to themselves, in that self-relation, they relate to themselves negatively. Non-being is inherent to their very constitution. In this very self-relation, they propel themselves beyond themselves. Now look, I'll never claim that Hegel's a great rhetorician in the science of logic. But there are some passages, right? And he's just giving you one there, I think, where he says, look, you want to know what finitude is? It's where you're propelled beyond yourself. It's where something is propelled beyond itself, not by something outside it, but by something that is endemic to it, but has not yet been integrated within it. Namely, otherness, alterity, negation. He says they relate to themselves negatively. In this very self-relation, they propel themselves, beyond their being. They are. So he always wants to go back and emphasize, look, this isn't becoming, right? Because now we have the stability of they exist. Right? Self-relatedness of being is real. It's not always collapsing, it's not always vanishing. We've now got some solidity to being, my term. But the truth of this being is, as in Latin, they're finis. They're in. The finite does not just alter, as something in general does, but perishes. And its perishing is not just a mere possibility, as if it might be without perishing. Rather, the being as such of finite things is to have the germ of this transgression, this vergehen, did you see the translator gives you that there? This passing away. In itself. And here's the flowery bit. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death. Now look, that is the point. That being is not just burdened with non-being, but non-being actually defines it as what it is. If that's the case, then every something, every self-relation, relates to itself ultimately negatively. So that it's constantly being overturned by that. The moment of their birth is the moment of their death. They bear within themselves constantly their own overturning. Welcome to finitude, right? Finitude is alteration. Finitude is constant change and transformation into something else. So on to infinity, as Hegel's about to say. Because that's an interminable process. It seems to never be ending. Now, so for existence to be as something, to be what it is only possible insofar as it's continually changing and transforming, becoming other than it is. The limit then that defines the existing something necessarily must be a limitation that ultimately constricts its being what it is. It's a Schranke. So he says, now if you look on 103, he makes this point very clear. This is at 119 in the German, 103 in the English. It's the second full paragraph down, about a quarter of the way down that paragraph. But further since, everybody see where I'm at? But further since. Fairly lengthy passage here, but worth taking a moment to look at. It says, but further, since otherness is determined as limit, Grenze, itself as negation of negation, the otherness immanent to the something is positive. Positive means it's set out. We now see it clearly. It wasn't there. It wasn't laid out before us. It wasn't positive, put on view before us before. As the connection of the relation, Zen, of the two sides are something and others. And the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong, is this relation turned back upon itself. This relation turned back upon itself. It is its reference turned back upon itself. Reference is really relation. So Zen, turned back upon itself. The relation to it of its implicitly existing determination that in it negates its immanent limit, negates its own limit. So the limit is its constitution, right? The othering gives it its limit. Stay within this boundary, don't go beyond it. And yet it's constantly pushes itself, propels itself out beyond that. Why? Because it's negative. So negativity is now inherent within something itself. It pushes it out beyond itself. He says at that moment, then what? The self-identical in itself thus relates itself to itself as is its own non-being, but as the negation of the negation is negating that which at the same time retains existence in it, for it is the quality of its in itselfness. Something's own limit, Grenze, thus posited by it as a negative that is at the same time essential, negative that is essential, is not only or merely limit as such, but it is limitation, restriction, Schranke. So if the limit is necessarily a limitation, then what defines something as what it is must be, ought to be, overcome in order for something to be what it is. The Zola now is endemic to the very nature of being itself. So the negation, we can say here at this moment of limitation, this moment of limit and limitation, this moment of limit and restriction, Grenze and Schranke, to use the German terms he's using for this. The negation there cuts in two ways. The limit is what defines the thing as its self-relation. It's what engenders the self-relation. But it also is what undoes that self-relation. It constitutes the self-relation of something, but it also undoes, continually undoes. So he says on 104, and this is the second to last paragraph, what ought to be is, right, that paragraph that is in my map, this is 120 in the German. He says, what ought to be is, and at the same time is not. What ought to be is, and at the same time is not. This is the main point he's trying to make here, that being both is and is not. But now the is not side is not burdened, right? The is not burdened with the is not. The is not is doing the work that really generates being, generates reality. If it were, it would not be, if it were, it would not be what merely ought to be. The ought has therefore a restriction essentially. So this restrictedness that's endemic to being is a feature of its being constantly undermined by negation. It has a limit, but ultimately that limit, which makes possible its self-relation, is undermined by that same negation. This restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is the determination, the Bestimmung, now posited as it is in fact, namely as at the same time only a determinateness. So it is what this thing is. What being is its ought. So finitude is something's being as defined by its non-being. Right? Finitude is what something is when it's defined, not just as being, with non-being along with it, but when non-being actually is. So now we reverse the prominence, right? To put it in very broad terms. We start off quality by saying, well, this is being with non-being, and really what's important is the being side. And so we go to reality, we go to something has a self-relation, and you go, well, yeah, it's differentiated off over against other. But then we start to realize other's actually doing the work. It's what's constituting the self-relation. Okay. So now we got a kind of parity between the two of them, right? Something and other, self-relation over here, negation, self-relation over here. And if that just happens, let's say once, then we're good. It's like we're stable again. We can stop. It's not how it works. Negation doesn't go undermine and then stop. It continually undermines. And because it continually undermines, then the constitution of being can't just simply be something and other. It's got to be the something constantly altering, constantly changing, constantly becoming other than it is. That's finitude. That's finitude. Well, that means that what looked to be, initially secondary, right? Non-being is secondary. It's not just in the same equality with being or equality with reality. It's actually more fundamental. That's what he's trying to let us know here, is that if you follow this thought out, if you just unpack what's imminently entailed by the work of negativity here, then negativity can't be secondary. But it also can't be on the same plane. It's actually got to be more fundamental. So finitude is thus intrinsically rather than extrinsically limited insofar as it is consigned to non-being, being for others, he'll call it here, by virtue of its own being in itself. So for something to be intrinsically limited means that it is not what it is supposed to be. To be limited means that it's not what it's supposed to be, what it ought to be. Finitude is not what its own being dictates it to be. It thus merely ought to be, and this oughting, I don't know a better way of putting this, that's what we're really talking about here. We're not talking about an ought, we're talking about an oughting, that's what negation's really doing. Is itself its limitation or constriction. Finitude is thus utterly negative, self-negating, and it continually undermines its own being. It is inherently always already other than itself. Yet with the limit now as what something ought to be other than, finitude is necessarily raised above this restriction. Finitude moves beyond, necessarily transcends itself, or sublates itself. Look at what he says on 105. This is the first full paragraph down. But now further as ought. So we've established that the very nature of being is as ought to be other than it is. The finite transcends its restriction. The finite transcends its restriction. Well, on one level you'll say, well, yeah, finitude is always changing, right? To be finite is to constantly be altering. So what's the big deal about that? Well, look at what Hegel says about that. The same determinist, which is its negation, is also sublated. So this isn't just a matter of, well, it changes and it changes and it changes and it changes. Yeah, that's true. But this continual changing, right, this continual overturning of itself, overcoming of itself, actually transcends it, says it ought to be other than it is, beyond what it is. As he says here, the same determinist which is its negation is also sublated, and is thus it's in itself. Its limit is also not its limit. Its limit is also not its limit. It's constantly being gotten beyond. So the finite, the limited, transcends its own finitude. That means finitude is necessarily infinity. He draws this. Next paragraph. As ought something is thus elevated above its restriction. He's already using this language of it's not just continual repetitive alteration. Sure, that's going on. He's not denying that, that's real, that happens. But if you follow this out, then that can't just be the end of the account. The end of the account's got to be, well, actually that's overcoming the very nature of itself at that point. Continually overcoming itself. As ought something is thus elevated above its restriction, above every restriction that it has. But conversely, it has its restriction only as ought. The two are indivisible. Something has a restriction insofar as it has negation in its determination. And the determination is also the being sublated of the restrictions, carrying us beyond. So in that sense, something is finite because its truth lies in its ending. Its ceasing to be is what it is, put it in those terms. So something is what it is, and it is only possible insofar as it is continually altering. And this means becoming other than it is. The limit then that defines the something of an existence as a whole necessarily must be a limitation that restricts its being. So that ontological demand of transformation is inherent within being itself. So finitude is thus utterly negative, self-negating. But what does that entail? Well, as he says, take a look back on 101 again. This is where he summarizes this, then he unpacks it and material that follows from it. It's worth taking a look again at 101. This is the hour of their birth is the hour of their death, right? That means that their finitude is not something that's incidental to them, it's packed into them. But that means they can't simply be finite. They can't simply be finite. Now, I'll just note here, for those of you who went to the Encyclopedia Logic, this is the reversal of how Hegel does it in the Encyclopedia Logic. Right? In the Encyclopedia Logic, he begins from the limitation restriction structure and derives alteration from that. Here, he started with alterability because negation alters, and then derives the limit restriction discussion from there. But he reverses that already. By 1817, he's convinced this unpacking of it doesn't work. But by 1831, he doesn't change it. And so, which one he thinks works best? Good question. Now, take a look at page 108. So, as usual with Hegel, on 108 he wants to say, okay, where have we got? He doesn't literally say that, that's what he does. Where have we got? What do we establish? So he'll usually just express it. Here's the thesis that we've gotten to so far. So he says, the ought contains restriction explicitly for itself, and restriction contains the ought. He thinks, right, we're good, we're there, right? That's not anything new, right? That we've already established. He then says, their mutual connection is the finite itself, okay, right? We know that already, which contains them both in itself. It's not incidental to them, it's actually what constitutes both of them, right? It's what something and other, reality and negation just are. It's what being is at this point. Being is the ought structure itself. Then he says this. These moments of its determination are qualitatively opposed. Restriction is determined as the negative of the ought equally as the negative of restriction. Okay, nothing new in there. But then look what he does. The finitude is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. We were just there. It is this contradiction between something and other, which is about the limit being transformed necessarily into a restriction. It others itself, and thereby transgresses, overcomes the restriction. But then there's just another restriction, and another restriction, and another. He says, the finite is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. It sublates itself. Now that's Hegel's term, as we know at this point, for something gets canceled here, but also something gets preserved. So think about how that works. What's getting canceled? Well, what's getting canceled here is the simple repetition of, self-relation of something, constant undermining of it. That's what's being canceled at this point. That's not what's really logically significant at this point. What is logically significant? Well, the overcoming of that movement itself. As he says, the finite is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. It sublates itself. It goes away and ceases to be. It passes away. This is structurally, it's not the same thing, but structurally like the vanishing of vanishing. So we're in a similar kind of position here. But notice what happens here. But this, its result, the negative as such, that's not where we were with vanishing, right? Vanishing was about stability. Here, being has proven itself to be what? Nothing other than negativity itself. What's the core of reality? The core of reality is negation. And the core of reality being negation means that it alters itself, it transforms itself. It's always ought to be other than it is. So it's finite precisely in that way. It's constantly, the moment of its birth is the moment of its death. That's what the nature of reality is. Then he says, so it's proved out that it's negation at its very core. It's negative at its very core. He says, but the negative as such is alpha, its very determination, for it is the negative of the negative. Now negativity is taken over, right? Negativity is doing all the work. Negativity is fundamental, more fundamental than reality. So in going away and ceasing to be, the finite has not ceased. Well, yeah, something ceased. Right, something ceased. The self-relatedness is constantly ceasing. But what's never ceasing, what's ceaseless, is that there's constantly negation. There's constantly negation. So there is a consistency, a constancy, better said, a constancy, a perduring, to put it in temporal terms, of negation. The finite has not ceased. So in going away and ceasing to be, it's not ceased. Self-relatedness has ceased. There's real transformation, there's real overturning here. We're not wrong that things change, right? Because that's endemic to the very nature of being itself. And what makes that endemic is negativity. So, if you just stopped the logic at this moment and said, what does that tell us about the world? It tells us the world is constantly in flux and change. Why? Because negation constantly lets things have stability. You, for example, or you, I and me, but we also are in the constant transformative process. Negation's constantly at work on us. So there's stability, there's a somethingness, a self-relation, but that something is, that self-relatedness is constantly being underdone. So what doesn't pass away, let's do it this way. What does pass away is the self-relatedness of each one of those transformative states. But what doesn't pass away is the transformations themselves, because there's constantly, ceaselessly negation of work. So in going away and ceasing to be, the finite has not ceased. It has only become momentarily an other finite which equally is. However, a going away as a going over into another finite, and so forth to infinity. So note what Hegel's doing here. He's saying both at one and the same time, something's not falling, it's not passing away, and that is that things constantly are changing. And that's going to go on ceaselessly, endlessly. Why? Because negation is ineliminable. So it will constantly be another something, another something, another something, another something. And that's the first reference to infinity. Another something, another something, another something. Add on to infinity. But then he says, but beta, if we consider this result more closely, in its going away and ceasing to be, in this negation of itself, the finite has attained its being in itself. In it, it has rejoined itself. All right. You should read that and go, excuse me, how's that work? I mean, maybe the alphabet works, right? I got it's transforming, one state's passing into another, passing into another, passing into another. Okay, fine. I'll let you have that. What's this bit about it rejoins itself? Well, he hypes that up a little further by, at the end of the paragraph, saying this. This is the last sentence of that paragraph. This identity with itself, so it's rejoined to itself, it's come into identity with itself. This identity with itself, the negation of negation, is affirmative being, is thus the other of the finite. The other of the finite. So now we were talking about just the something and other, and it transforms something into another, to another other, another other, another other. There's our so on into infinity. Aren't we done? Hegel wants to say, no, actually that tells us that infinity is endemic to the very nature of finitude itself. In fact, it is what finitude is. He says, is thus the other of the finite, which is supposed to have the first negation for its determinants. This other is the infinite. Now, Hegel's just clearly made a fairly preposterous claim. Right? Hegelians don't often think so because we're so, mired in Hegel that we think, well, yeah, the finite's the infinite. What's wrong with that? Right? I mean, aren't we all good with that? And you ought to go, no, I'm not good with that. Those terms don't, doesn't fit, right? Finite is the infinite. That's just to make you confuse something. So Hegel wants to say right to you about that. He knows he's stated a flat-out contradiction. He just said so. That's what finitude is. It's a flat-out contradiction. And he's telling you what that contradiction is. It's a ceaseless turmoil that's undermining everything as it is, and that happens so on to infinity. So there's that sense of infinity with just endlessness, an endless beyond that never is attainable. And yet also that process whereby everything is such that it is at all, is what finitude is. And that process is not a beyond. That process isn't a, put it very bluntly, he's about to do something fairly close to this in the next few pages. That infinity is not a noun. It is in one sense a noun, it's a beyond, right? It's something that we constantly are asymptotically, use the Kantian language, approaching. We're always getting closer to it, right? The infinity that lies out there, so on and so on and so forth, to on ad infinitum. Hegel says, yeah, that's there. It's what he calls spurious, what we call spurious infinity, bad infinity. Finite infinity is what Hegel calls it. Finite infinity. It's a limited form of infinity. Now, I think it's always important to sort of stop at that moment, because Hegel scholars will go, yeah, but that's a bad form of infinity, so let's move on to the good one. As though the bad one wasn't real. Hegel's saying the bad one's real. That there is an absolute ontological reality to ad infinitum infinity. The noun form of infinity, the beyond. Because you can talk about, well, this is transforming into this, and that's transforming into that, and that seems to be going on, and just ceaseless turmoil into something other, and something other, something beyond continually. And Hegel wants to say, that's what finitude is, my friend. The hour of its birth is the hour of its death. That's just what it means, right? To be finite. That's what it means to say being is finite. So he doesn't want to say bad infinity is a sham. He wants to say bad infinity is one way of understanding infinity in terms of its finiteness, its own limitedness. It's that which is beyond whatever current limitation we stand at. It's beyond that. As the grass grows green on the other side, a version of infinity. But then he also wants to say, so that's him establishing the bona fides, the ontological bona fides, what we call spurious infinity. And what I would say in Hegel is real infinity. It's a real form of infinity. It's finite infinity. It's noun beyond form of infinity. That's just not the truth of infinity. That's Hegel's point. This is the harder pill to swallow, right? That first one you can go, okay, he's saying everything is in constant alteration. Yeah. It is that because negativity is at work constantly. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Well, then that's an interminable process. He's exactly the same. So there's always a beyond, it's other than any particular self-relation. That's exactly what he's saying. So there's a kind of infinity that lies beyond any determination. Exactly right. And you want to say, well, then that's all we need to think about this? No, because that's not finitude is infinity. That's finitude is always approximating, asymptotically getting close to, but never actually getting to infinity. That wouldn't allow you the predication that finite is infinite. So what does he mean by infinity in the second sense? He thinks the truth of infinity is not its beyond. That the infinity is, no big surprise here, not a noun, not a thing, not a limited, restricted thing, state that you get to, or always approximating but never actually getting there. He thinks infinity is the process itself. So, pardon me, I don't know a better way of putting this. Infinitizing is what he thinks is what finitude actually is. That inherent within, not beyond it, but inherent, endemic within, immanent within finitude is a process whereby something comes to be what it is and becomes other than it is and becomes itself in and through that othering. Something comes to be what it is by becoming other than it is and comes to be itself precisely through that othering. So that othering is not constantly taking it towards some beyond. That's not the truth of what infinity is. Infinity actually names that process itself. Names that process itself. So when Hegel says that finitude just is infinity, he means infinity there as it's a process. A process of what? Generative negation. Because that's the only process we've got on logical view here. Okay, make a little bit of sense? So take a look with me. This is on pages 108 to 120 now. He now lays out what he means by infinity, these two forms of infinity. What he calls on 110 to 113, this is pages 126 to 131 really in the German. What he calls the alternating determinations, right? That's what Hegel scholars usually describe as spurious infinity, bad infinity. Hegel calls it alternating determinations. I think it's a fine definition, right? Fine name for it, because that's what it does. It's really about the interminable, ceaseless alteration of one determination into another determination. That nothing ever stays what it is. That nothing ever remains. It does have a solidity to it. It is something. It has a self-relatedness to it. But that self-relatedness is always being undermined as well. The hour of its birth, its coming to being, is the hour of its passing away. Now we have some stability to those moments of coming to being and passing away that we did not have in the coming. So now we have a kind of infinity. He calls it, at one point, the non-finite. That's how he defines infinity first. It's the non-finite. It's not what all those determinations are. Because each one of those determinations, those ceaseless, constantly altering determinations, yeah, that's not what infinity is in this noun sense, this alteration of determinations. So we could talk about then infinity as contrasted with the finite. That is, it's contrasted with a series of existent determinacies, a series of consistent changing realities. In that sense, if we contrast it with that, the infinite is indeterminate emptiness. It's a beyond, he says, a beyond the finite, whose being in itself is not in its existence. It's not anything that exists. It's always something that's other than existence. Here's alterity as such, if you want to put it in those terms. The infinite in this form, someone did write a book called Totality and Infinity for a reason. Right? Infinity is this kind of infinity. In that term. The infinite in this form is what the finite should or ought to be. If finitude is fundamentally, and its fundamental character is ought to be other than it is, then it ought ultimately to be this infinity that it is not. It is what the finite is always not. The infinite is always what the finite is not. And thus the infinite is merely a beyond precisely because it excludes, it negates the finite. The non-finite. It is therefore, infinity is an infinity limited by and bounded by the finite that it opposes. This is why Hegel also called a limited infinity, playing on the term, right? How can infinity, right, unboundedness, how can it be bounded? Well, it's bounded by the fact that it's other than, right, now all existent finite determinations. It is thus a finite or limited infinity that ought to include what it is not, namely finitude, is what he says on 128 through 129 in the German. This is on 111 to 112 in the English. It's a ceaseless repetition of an external limit. Take a look on 113, right at the bottom. The last lines is 130 in the German. 113, the last 1, 2, 3. About 7 lines from the bottom of 113. This infinite has the rigid determination. Focus on that notion of rigid. Whenever Hegel tells you something has a rigid determination, it's static, it's stable. You know that something's about to unfold, right? Because he's telling you, this looks like it has a rigidity to it, something that's going to stay and be stable. It won't. The infinite has this rigid determination of a beyond, jenseits, that cannot be attained. We can never actually successfully fulfill it, for the very reason that it ought not be attained. So now the ought structure, which is ought to be otherwise, is saying it ought to be the infinite, but the ought there can never be fully attained. Since the determinants of the beyond, of an existent determination, has not been let go. It's constantly undermining it, right? There's the negation constantly undermining every something, so it can't be what it is. In this determination, this is not the only determination, but in this determination, the infinite has the finite as a this side, he's playing now jenseits, diesseits, over against it. A finite that is likewise unable to raise itself up to the infinite just because it has this determination of an other. That is, an existence that perennially regenerates itself in that beyond precisely by being different from it, different from the finite. So there's Hegel's account of infinity, right? Spurious infinity, alternating determination infinity, non-finitude. The noun version of it. And I just want to submit to you, that's not him saying, and this is all illusory. Never once says that, because he doesn't think it. He thinks that's a real thing, right? Infinity in the sense of non-finitude is a real thing. It's a real ontological structure out there in being. It's just that it's not the ultimate truth of what infinity is. We're going to do this several times in the logic, where we'll say something is, but that's not its ultimate truth. Right? Hegel will do this most emphatically at the beginning of the essence logic, where he'll say the essence will reduce being to merely shine, right? Illusory being. But when it grounds it, it will be Erscheinung, right? It will be the appearance of that which is grounded. And he'll say then it is what it seemed to be. Now actually it's grounded and is what it properly is. So he's doing that here with infinity. So the reason why let's call it the bad infinite, or the alternating determinations of the infinite, reason why that is why we have that, is there's this constant repetition of the finite and its negation. And that's because the concept of infinity hasn't let go of the immediate difference between the finite and its other. That the finite is not the finite. The infinite is not the finite. So the transition from alternating determinations to true infinity thus comes precisely by infinity itself, not us, note. The problem's not us. Right? The problem in the logic is never us. Right? What motivates the transition can't be, well, there's a problem in thought, and we have to revise our thinking. Right? Thought got trapped into thinking the beyond, infinity as beyond. No, that's because infinity really is a beyond. But that's not the whole of what it is. It's something more. It has more determinations to it. So it has to have both of those moments within itself, both something and other within itself, reality and negation, being and non-being. And that's what true infinity does. So take a look on, this is 114. This is 114 all the way over to 120. 114 over 120. And here he talks about it as not as a noun or as the non-finite. Infinity is not the non-finite. Infinity is a process. Infinity is a process. Now, it's worth getting what he's doing here for this specific transition. He's clearly arguing that if you just unpack the determinations of reality, as it is burdened by initially, as it's ultimately constituted by negation, that means it's ultimately finitude. That existence just necessarily and eminently is finite. Can't but be finite. Because its self-relatedness is constantly being undermined. So that alternating determinations are going on. But that means that it will ultimately always be pointing out towards or oriented towards something that it is not yet. And that will be the beyond. That's its alternating determinations point to this kind of infinity as a noun, as beyond. But that'll be a limited form of infinity. Right? That's what Hegel's saying about it. That's a limited form of infinity because it's cut off from the finite. But that also means that it's both of those at the same time. Now, and that's true infinity. Right? This is what he's talking about on one, what he's called here, affirmative infinity on 114 through 120. And affirmative infinity is the process that generates both moments. Both the moment of the finite and the beyond. Because it's, no surprise here, negation. So infinitizing is not something that stands out beyond finitude. It's endemic within the very process that is finitude itself. So it's worth knowing that. Right? More about that as we go along. Here's something we're going to come up against in the logic several times, and that's this. Hegel's going to say, well, look, we'll start off on one side, and one side will entail another side. And so then you'll have two things that are the relata, and they look like they're in relation to one another. So here, we start off with reality, negation, becomes something and other. Those are the relata. They seem to have a necessary relation. That's when nothing constitutes the very nature of what it is for something to be, right? For the somethingness of being itself. And that will constantly overturn it. And so then we start to think, well, what is this relation about? That relation, the relata are in a relation that actually overturns them, necessarily overturns. So that the relata are constantly transforming all the time. They're alternating and changing all the time. And there is, a sense in which that can go on interminably, and that beyond, that it's always approaching but never accomplishing, never realizing, is alternating determination form of infinity, the non-finite. But then Hegel will say, okay, that's relational thinking, and that's brilliant, that's right, that's true, that's what these concepts have entailed. The inferential chain has demanded, has necessarily shown us this is where this flows. But we've missed something here. And what we've missed here is the process that's making this happen. That's making what happen? That's making the relata be at all, and making the relationship between the relata happen. With the notion of infinity, Hegel's naming that process. Not the first time, right? He's already named it twice before, right? He's named it as becoming, he's named it as negation, right? So we've been there, and he'll remind us of this in just a moment, but he's saying here very clearly something a pattern that will repeat throughout the logic, which is things are in relation to one another that appear not to be in relation at all. So they're actually relata of a relation. And that relata of that relation has to be, and the relata have to be accounted for. So that relation is not extrinsic to the relata. The relation actually constitutes each moment of the relation as what it is here, reality, negation, something other, finitude, and infinity, in the alternating determination, non-finite sense of infinity. But there's something that actually produces both of those moments and the relationship between them. And that is a process that's not reducible to either side. It's not finitude, it's not infinity. It's affirmative infinity, it's the truth of infinity, which is this infinitizing process itself. So that's a process, a logical entailment we'll see happen repeatedly throughout the logic. That something is in relation to something else, and you'll think, oh, okay, well that's the message. Well, then it's about the relation. Okay, well then that's the message. And in the doctrine of being, it's really going to turn out to be about relationality. You'll see this in measure next week. I mean, it turns out the measure is defined as what? The relation between quality and quantity. Measure is the name for it. But he's going to say that's going to entail a deeper level. That being entails essence. The deeper level is going to be that. We'll see how that works. That's even more crazy than what we're about to do with quality and quantity, quality going into quantity. But regardless, it'll be about that relation. Then it'll be about the process. So every once in a while in the text, the process moment will emerge and be prominent. And then it'll be back to the relata and the relations. That'll be true throughout everything we're going to read this quarter. You'll see the prominence given to the relata, the relata, and the relation itself. All the way through the doctrine of essence, that's the case as well. And then towards the end of the doctrine of essence, he begins to focus on, again, on the process that makes all that possible. And then the doctrine of the concept will be all about the process as such, because it turns out this is the right way to read this book. The process is what generates the relata and the relation itself. So that regressive moving back into the ground, once the ground of all things, is a process. All right, so take a look on 117 with me for just a moment. Let's work our way through this, and then we'll take a break. So here's Hegel summarizing the argument he wants to make about these different forms of infinity and how they relate to one another and where that takes us. He says this. This is on 117, this is 134 in the German. In the first place, first full paragraph down on 117, everybody see where I'm at? In the first place, the negation of the finite and the infinite, so separation of them from one another, which is posited in the infinite progression, can be taken as simple, and hence as mutual externality, only a following of one upon the other. So there's alternating determinations. That's clearly what he's talking about there. So we're talking about infinity in that first form of this is changing into that changes into that. It seems to be eternal. Starting from the finite, the limit is thus transcended, the finite negated. We now have it's beyond the infinite, but in this, the limit rises up again, so we keep getting this problem of the repetition of the limit. So we have the transcending of the infinite. This twofold sublation is nonetheless partly only an external event and alternating of moments in general, and partly still not posited as one unity. So it's thought as separate from one another. It's two moments. It's the relata, thought against one another. You have finitude and infinity set against one another. One's approaching the other. Finitude is approaching infinity, but never fully getting This twofold sublation is nonetheless partly only an external event, something outside, beyond, and an alternating of moments in general, and partly still not posited as one unity. Each of these moves beyond is an independent starting point, a fresh act, so that the two fall apart. So it's constantly, okay, what's the beyond next? What's the next beyond? What's other than this? What's beyond that? But in addition, their connection is also present. So there's the relata, here's the relation, connection, relation. But in addition, their connection, their relation is also present in the infinite progression. The finite comes first, then there is the transcending of it, and this negative, or this beyond of the finite, is the infinite. Third, this negation is transcended in turn, a new limit comes up, a finite again. This is the complete self-closing movement that has arrived at that which made the beginning. What emerges is the same as that from which the departure was made. That is, the finite is restored, the latter has therefore rejoined itself, in its beyond has only found itself again. So, how do you have finitude over against infinity? The two relata are necessary, the relation actually constitutes finitude as what it is. It's always approaching or approximating the beyond of infinity. Then he flips it, next paragraph. The same is the case regarding the infinite. In the infinite, in the beyond of the limit, only a new limit arises which has the same fate, namely that as finite it must be negated. Thus, what is again at hand is the same infinite that just now has disappeared in the new limit. By being sublated by traversing the new limit, the infinite has not therefore advanced one jot further. It has distanced itself neither from the finite, for the finite is just this, to pass over to the infinite, nor from itself, for it has arrived at itself. All right, so both moments are just what they are by virtue of their relationship to the other. You can't get finitude without infinity, you can't get infinity without finitude. That's what he's just taking himself to have shown. He's summarizing that in these two paragraphs. But then look what he draws from that. This is the key, right? If he just stopped there, he would be making the fairly mundane, but significant and important point that no finitude without infinity, no infinity without finitude. Right? That's not nothing, right? Because typically we tend to say finitude is the mark of the human and it limits us, and Hegel's just reminding us the only way you can talk about us as limited is there's something beyond us that you can compare that to. As Kant famously said, right, in the Third Critique, if you want to talk about a discursive intellect, a limited intellect, you've got to talk about an intellectual intuition that is God. And God gives you a comparative then by which you can do this. So there is a kind of infinite finitude relationship. But that's the only way you can talk about either one of them, actually. You can't talk about any one of them on their own. The two relata necessarily stand in co-constituting mutually implicative relationship to one another. Now, if you just stop there, you would make an important point. But for Hegel, that's not the ultimate point he wants to make. That's not the point he's trying to make here, ultimately. It's the point he's making. It's not the ultimate point he's making. What is it? Look at the next paragraph. Thus, the finite and the infinite are both this movement. We went from the relata to the relation, now to the movement, the process. This movement of each returning to itself through its negation. The finite comes to be itself by being other than itself, othering itself. But so does the infinite. The infinite is itself by othering itself. They are just both this process. They are only as implicit mediation. And the affirmative of each contains the negative of each, and is the negation of the negation. So there's that famous line of determinate negation, negates itself. Here we see it in borne out. They are thus a result, and as such, not in the determination that they had at the beginning. Neither is the finite in existence on its side, nor the infinite in existence or being in itself beyond that existence. That is, beyond existence and determination of finitude. They're both this process. That's what really the truth of them names. He says now, take a look on 118. Paragraph right there and begins on this page. If this imminent turning back has for the moment been reconvened. So if finitude and infinity are necessarily mutually implicative of one another, if they both are just this process of becoming other, right? They're just both naming that. I mean, at this point you want to say, oh, I'm massively confused, right? Because finite and infinite mean the same damn thing. And Hegel's saying, yes, they do. They absolutely do. I know it's confusing. I know we want to keep our vocabulary, our terminology, our dictionary expressions, these words separate from one another. That's not how they actually work. If you examine them, they necessarily unfold into this. If this imminent turning back has for the moment been reckoned to be just as much the turning back of the finite to itself and of the infinite to itself, that's what we just shown. Noticeable in this result is an error connected with the one-sidedness just criticized. So here's where he thinks is where we get fixated. We get fixated on one side or the other. The finite and then the infinite is each taken as the starting point, and only in this way, two results ensue. So it looks like we go from the finite to the infinite. Okay, now we've got finitude, it's what is not the infinite, and now we know what the infinite is, it's not the finite. So there's the relation of negation between them. He says, but it is a matter of total indifference which is taken as a starting point. Why? Because this is all part of one process. One's not the starting point, the other is the ending point, either side. But it's a matter of total indifference which is taken as a starting point. And with this, the distinction caused by the duality of results dissolves of itself. This is not us doing this, right? It's not our thinking breaks down here and we can't figure out which is first and which is last. That's the nature of the beast itself. It's the nature of the matter itself. This is likewise posited in the line of infinite progression, open-ended on both sides, wherein each of the moments recurs in equal alternation and is totally extraneous at which position the progression is arrested and taken as beginning. The moments are distinguished in the progression, but each is equally only moment of the other. Each is what it is only in through this process. Since both the finite and the infinite are themselves moments of the progress, they are jointly the finite, and since they are equally jointly negated in it, and in the result, this result as the negation of their joint finitude is called with truth the infinite. They're both the finite, they're both the infinite. They're both moments of the same process. Their distinction is thus the double meaning which they both have. The finite has the double meaning first of being the finite over against the infinite, which stands over against it. There's the infinite is the non-finite, right? The noun form. And second of being at the same time the finite and the infinite over against the infinite, right? Over against this infinity itself. Also, the infinite has the double meaning of being one of the two moments. It is then the bad infinite, here's where Hegel uses the terminology, and of being the infinite in which the two moments itself and its other are only moments. Therefore, in fact, as we now have it, the nature of the infinite is that it is the process in which it lowers itself to be only one of its determinations over against the finite, and therefore itself only one of the finites, and elevates this distinction of itself and itself to be self-affirmation. And through this mediation, the true infinite. So all we mean by the true infinite is not the infinite that's better than the non-finite. We mean the process that makes finitude and infinity what they are. Now, Hegel knows where he's taking it, right? So look at what he says here, still on 118. Look at next paragraph down, then we'll take a break, I promise. This determination of the true infinite cannot be captured in the already criticized formula of a unity of the finite and the infinite. This always runs through my mind, by the way, whenever I'm at conferences and people tell me, Hegel is really the thinker of the unity of identity and non-identity. Because I think he just said that's an inadequate formulation. It can't be the unity of the two. This determination of the true infinite cannot be captured in the already criticized formula of a unity of the finite and the infinite. Unity is abstract, motionless self-sameness, and the moments are likewise unmoved beings. So he's telling you, that's crap. Right? That's not an adequate way of expressing what we've just shown to be a process. It's a fine way of talking about the relata and their relationship to one another, and that's important and significant. It's an advance to talk about their relationship to one another. That's a good thing, right? But that's not the ultimate thing that's trying to be shown here. Becoming has for its determinations, this is what he's backing out, literally going all the way back to becoming. Right? Becoming has for its determinations, first, abstract being and nothing is alteration. It has existence, something, another. So he's just telling you, I was talking about becoming, then I was talking about alteration. They each have their moments. But now we're talking about what? Infinite. So infinite is the successor to becoming, successor to alteration. So it's a process, as you've just been telling me, because becoming was a process, but a process where each side collapsed. There was no stability to each side. In alteration, you have the constant overturning of the self-sameness, right, the self-relation. But you don't ever have this otherness integrated into the self-sameness. Here, in infinity, you have both moments now integrated into one process. They're both distinct moments, but they're distinct moments of one process. So he says, it has existence, something another. Now as infinite, it has finite and infinite. These two themselves are in becoming. This infinite, true infinite, as being turned back unto itself, as relation of itself to itself, is being. but not indeterminate abstract being, for it is posited as negating the negation. Consequently, it is also existence or there-ness. He's literally redoing the entirety of the road that we traveled to get to here. For it, top of page 119, for it contains negation in general and consequently determinants. It is and is there present before us. Taken out in the next paragraph right in the middle of 119. True infinity, thus taken in general as existence, posited as affirmative, in contrast to abstract negation, is reality in a higher sense than it was earlier as simply determined. It has now obtained a concrete content. Here's what we did not have with being, here's what we did not have with existence. We didn't have a concrete content. It's not terribly concrete. We don't have any real world determinacies going on, save one thing. Becoming is now alteration, is now infinity, which generates what? The finite and the infinite. Not nothing, something. Thus reality is further determined as essence, concept, idea, and so, this is the rest of the book. Right? So he's talking about what's momentous in this advance, the logical advance. Let me leave it there. We'll talk about being for itself. We'll come back after the break, and then that'll lead us into this bit about the quality transition, and then we'll take it from there. Fine. Right? So 444, come back to 454. Thanks.